So hi everyone. I hope you can hear and see the slides okay. My name is Jessica Martin and I'm currently a third year PhD student working with Dr. Kate Bake at the University of Cambridge. And today I'm going to give an update of some research I've been conducting with children and young people with CASK-related disorder. So sorry if I'm looking between, I'm managing notes on one computer and slides on another computer, but I am with you. So in so we're a group of researchers. So the Bingo Project is an umbrella project, and we're a group of researchers who are interested in children and individuals that have a neurodevelopmental disorder that's caused by a rare genetic condition, and specifically those that are caused by a spelling difference, a single letter spelling difference in DNA, and we call these single nucleotide or single gene variant differences. So, one of the reasons that we're interested is that although these genetic causes are individually rare, collectively they're common. And this is because of an increased ability to detect rare genetic causes of neurodevelopmental disorder. So, we know that random spontaneous variants, which we call de novo variants, so they're not inherited from either parent, account for approximately 2 to 500 individuals that are born with a with a neurodevelopmental disorder, and more than 1,000 genes in total have been associated with neurodevelopmental disorders. And many individuals with these rare genetic causes of neurodevelopmental disorder present with complex medical features from things such as brain structural differences, epilepsy, and movement disorders, but they also might experience emotional behavioural difficulties or mental health symptoms. And we do know from recent kind of literature that mental health symptoms are highly prevalent in individuals that have a rare genetic cause of neurodevelopmental disorder, and that some of the common presentations might be anxiety and a behavioural disorder called oppositional defiant disorder, which is characterised by hostile and disobedient behaviours. Um, so, despite the fact that we know that neurodevelopmental and emotional behavioural difficulties might be common in rare genetic conditions, this area is currently relatively understudied. So, in Bingo, we aim to address three large research questions exploring what the range of neurodevelopmental and emotional behavioural difficulties might be within a single condition or in a group of conditions. So, do individuals present with these four different characteristics or these three? How might these different neurodevelopmental and emotional behavioural difficulties be related to each other? So we can see here the orange, the green, and the purple brains are kind of clustering or behaviours are clustering together. But now we see this different pattern. So trying to understand patterns of how difficulties might be related to each other, and then also to think about what factors might predict differences. So is that a positive predictor? Does it explain kind of why someone might experience more difficulties? Or is it a negative predictor? Does it explain why someone might experience less difficulties? And taken together by answering these questions, we might better understand neurodevelopmental and emotional behavioural difficulties alongside what we already might know about medical features or other difficulties. So, where does our CAST story begin? So, I'd already started my PhD in 2021, so a little while ago now, looking at emotional behavioural difficulties in girls who have a different genetic condition called DDXX-related disorder. But similarly to CASK, the DDXX gene is located on the X chromosome, and the disorder associated with differences in DDXX also predominantly affects females. And at this time, we were very lucky to meet Laura, who is hosting today, and many of you know is the director of CASK Research UK. And when we were lucky to meet Laura, she informed us that many of the CASK families have similar questions about emotional behavioural difficulties in CASK because there's not that much known about this at the moment. So together we kind of came up with several questions that reflect our interest as bingo research, but also those of the families of individuals that have a child with a CASK gene difference. So we first want to understand what the range of neurodevelopmental and emotional behavioural characteristics are in CASK-related disorder, how these different characteristics might be related to each other, and then also whether neurological features such as epilepsy or brain structural differences predict neurodevelopmental variability, so how severe your developmental delay might be. So before I move on to kind of talk about our methods and our preliminary results, I first wanted to share some findings of a recent review we conducted of published literature to better understand what we already know about the medical characteristics that are associated with CASK-related disorder. And just to mention that this work was conducted by our lovely research assistant, Alki, who is also on the call today. So I'm sure if there are any specific questions, she can answer those too. But this is all Alki's work, so just to credit her for this. So Alki identified 14 research papers that covered, that included at least 3 newly reported individuals with the CASK gene difference, and discussed their presentation of medical characteristics. So across these papers, there were 151 unique individuals, what to the best of our knowledge, and the majority of them were girls, and they were aged between 2 weeks and 49 years old. And in terms of their genetic difference, more than 70% had a single spelling difference in their DNA. So this is what we call a single nucleotide variant, rather than a large chunk of DNA missing that includes the CASK gene. And then they also had a de novo mutation. So this was spontaneous or random. So it wasn't inherited. The majority had a spontaneous or random variant. So it wasn't inherited from either of their parents. And across these different papers, we saw that common clinical characteristics or medical characteristics that were reported were structural brain abnormalities. So MICPCH, which Kirsten's already talked about, which is microcephaly, and then also hyperplasia of the pons and cerebellum, which are 2 regions of the brain. So they're smaller than they would usually expected to be. And then also developmental delays. We found that almost 90% of individuals had a severe or profound developmental delay. That epilepsy and seizures were very common, so almost 50% of individuals had epilepsy or had experienced a seizure, and that also another common characteristic was tone abnormality. So hypertonia, this can be kind of very stiff and rigid, whereas hypotonia is more floppy and stiff. Oh, sorry, floppy. Stiff is hypotonia. So these are some of the things we reported. We've also been able to look at things like Kirsten got a question about visual impairments or hearing difficulties. So when Alki's kind of had a chance to look through some of these papers more, we'll be able to kind of report what are the percentages of individuals kind of experiencing these difficulties across the published literature. But one thing I think is really important to note is that there weren't very many papers reporting any social or emotional behavioural difficulties, and only 4 papers, in fact. And this might be sound like quite a promising finding that we're not seeing many children experience emotional behavioural difficulties, but I think it might reflect the fact that many of these papers come from a medical or genetic background where there tends to be a higher focus on characterising medical characteristics. And also that in children that do have a severe developmental delay, it's very hard to kind of identify what is their developmental delay or what might be a behavioural difficulty, what might be a social emotional difficulty. I think we really need to pay attention and use kind of measures that are able to capture these difficulties in children that have a developmental delay, so we can better understand whether that is something that they experience as a difficulty or if it's not. So that kind of leads us on to the Bingo project. So with the support of the CASK Coalition and many families, and as well as Unique, which is another charity based here in the UK, we're able to recruit 3 to 25-year-olds with a diagnosed CASK gene variant from across the world that also experience neurodevelopmental difficulties. And these families were invited to complete online questionnaires and an interview, and a subset of families that had a child aged 3 to 7 and were based in the UK were asked to take part in a play-based assessment at home. But today I'm just going to be focusing on data and information that was collected via these online questionnaires and interviews. And these online questionnaires and interviews included a measure of an individual's medical history. So we are able to ask parents about whether their child had issues such as vision or hearing or motor problems and epilepsy, which I'm going to report some data on today. We asked about adaptive ability, which includes an individual's daily living skills, communication abilities, and motor skills, about any emotional behavioural problems such as anxieties or worries, or depression and low mood, etc. We asked about autism characteristics, so this can include difficulties with social communication and interaction, about repetitive behaviours, so behaviours that an individual repeats over and over again, or repetitive speech, and kind of stereotyped behaviours. We also asked about cerebral visual impairment, which is problems with processing visual information in the brain. And children that have a cerebral vision impairment might show symptoms such as poor visual fixation or following an object in space. So who ended up taking part? So 47 children or young people with a CASK variant across the world registered to take part in the bingo project. And of these, 32 individuals gave their consent to take part, and 30 completed at least some of the questionnaires and interview measures. And just to note, there were 2 families in the UK that I got the lovely opportunity to go meet and carry out play-based assessments with. Although I won't speak about that today, it was a really great opportunity, and it's lovely to be able to actually meet families and children that have a CASK gene difference in person. So focusing on these measures, so who were the people that completed them? So the majority were girls. They were aged between 3 and 25 years old. The majority had a single spelling difference in their DNA, so a CNV, and around 40% had a parent-reported epilepsy. So we asked parents in the medical history questionnaire, has your child ever had epilepsy? And these around 40% of parents said yes. So our first research question was to understand the range of neurodevelopmental and emotional behavioural difficulties in CASK-related disorder. So to do this, we took those measures that I described earlier, and we plotted individuals' data. So I'm just going to go through what these plots show, so hopefully they'll make more sense. So we first start off by plotting an individual score. So these are individuals and their score on a measure. And then we add a chart which shows the range of these scores, as well as the 25 and 75% interval and the average score. And then we add a density distribution so we can see where kind of more people are scoring or less people are scoring. And these plots are known as rain cloud plots because they look slightly like a rain cloud. But the plots I'm going to be showing you are twisted to their vertical, so they'll look a little bit like this. So starting off, I'm going to talk about the measure of adaptive ability. And on this measure, scores that are higher represent less difficulties, so less severe developmental difficulties. If we focus on this composite score, which combines the subscales of communication, daily living skills, and socialization, we can see that children and young people with CASK-related disorder are represented across all 5 severity bands. And just to note, these severity bands are those that have been established in children both with and without neurodevelopmental difficulties. So they're not specific to rare genetic conditions, but they help us get an understanding of the kind of severity of developmental delay or difficulties in children with genetic conditions such as CASK. So yeah, we can see that children are kind of spread across the range of severities. And I think one thing to note is, though the motor composite is not kind of the motor subscale is not included in the composite, we can see that it's very similar in terms of the pattern of distribution. So children are kind of covering the range of scores. And I think one thing to also note is that this communication domain, when we look at the average scores, this is a dark band in the middle, it's kind of lower down, and that's showing that this is actually maybe one of the more severely affected subscales. So children maybe might have with CASK might have more difficulties in communication relative to difficulties in daily living skills and socialization. But another thing to note is that age might be playing a role here. So depending on how old you are, you might be expected to kind of have more language abilities than if you're a younger child. So I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. So the next measure is a measure of emotional behavioural problems, and on this measure, higher scores represent more difficulties. And the total score is made up of 5 subscales, which includes disruptive behaviour, self-absorbed behaviour, communication difficulties, anxiety, and difficulties of social relating. And again, if we focus on the total score, which is the score in yellow here, we can see that children and young people represented across kind of the top 2 bands, which are kind of moderate and relatively more serious difficulties. And again, thinking about what domain might be most individuals might have more difficulties in, we can see that this black band here, which is showing the average score, is slightly higher for the self-absorbed subscale. Self-absorbed is a bit of a strange name for this subscale, but what it includes is difficulties in things such as eating non-food items or making non-speech sounds. So some behaviours that in the broader literature they might associate with someone that has an intellectual disability. Okay. So, sorry, there are quite a few of these, but I promise they hopefully are interesting. So the next measure is a measure of autism characteristics, and this measure was designed as a screening tool to identify children in a wider population who might be likely to have a diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder. And just to note that we tend to see quite high scores on this in individuals that are diagnosed with a rare genetic cause of neurodevelopmental difficulties. So we're not interested in using this measure to decide whether or not children meet diagnostic criteria for autism, but more to understand variability in the different kind of dimensions that might make up autism and represent different autism characteristics. So like the previous measure, higher scores represent more difficulties, and the total score is comprised of 5 subscales, including social awareness, social cognition, communication, social motivation, and restricted and repetitive behaviours. And if we focus on the total score, we can see individuals are represented across the mild, moderate, and severe bands. So that again shows that autism characteristics are highly variable within children and young people that have a CASK-related disorder. And if we focus on the subscale scores, we can see that children and young people with a CASK-related disorder might have relative strengths or fewer difficulties with social motivations relative to the other subscales when we pay attention to this thick black band, which is the average score. Okay. So we also have a measure of repetitive behaviour, and the higher scores represent more repetitive behaviours. And again, we can see a kind of wide range of scores as people scoring both above and below the kind of cutoff threshold for repetitive behaviours. And finally, a measure of cerebral vision impairment, which is difficulties like a problem with the brain in processing visual information. And there's a range of scores. This measure doesn't have a kind of clear cutoff to use, but I think it's just important to demonstrate that there's, again, variability in the range of difficulties that children and young people with CASK-related disorder might have. So taken together, these different plots kind of address the question of looking at whether there's a range of different neurodevelopmental difficulties and actually show that they're kind of highly variable. So just because you have a CASK-related disorder doesn't mean you'll have necessarily severe difficulties. You might have kind of more mild difficulties, and it really varies from individual to individual. So our second question was to think about what are the relationships between characteristics and CASK-related disorder. So for example, is having if you're an individual that has high autistic traits, do you also have high emotional behavioural difficulties? Or if you have a more severe developmental disability, do you have more severe emotional behavioural difficulties? So we wanted to try and understand how these things might be related to each other. And to do that, we ran what is called a correlation analysis. So I'm now going to show you a plot which shows the strength of the relationships between pairs of characteristics from -1 in blue to +1 in red, and positive numbers in blue represent relationships whereby a score on one measure increases, so does the score on the second measure, whereas negative numbers represent a negative relationship, and these are in blue, and that's when a score on one measure increases, the score on the second measure decreases. And just to note, there are some measures here where you can only be one thing or another. So you can't be on a scale. You're either a male or a female, or you have parent-reported epilepsy or you don't. And just to note that for these scores, a more positive number means that you're more likely to be a female or more likely to have epilepsy. So I hope that makes sense. And if there are any questions, let me know. So we found 3 different significant pairs of relationships, one between age and adaptive ability, between epilepsy and adaptive ability, and between emotional behavioural problems and repetitive behaviours. I'm going to just talk through these a little bit more, what we think they might mean. So firstly, we found a significant positive relationship between adaptive ability, which is shown here on the bottom. Just to note, this score has been reversed from earlier, so now higher scores represent more difficulties with adaptive ability, and then age here on the vertical. So this kind of shows that as there's a relationship between getting older and having more difficulties with adaptive ability. It was mentioned earlier in the questions about regression, and this isn't showing regression of ability because it's across individuals across the window of time. So it doesn't mean that adaptive ability declines with age. And we have found this relationship in other rare genetic conditions that are associated with neurodevelopmental difficulties. And it could be due to the way that the measure is scored, because as you get older, you have more expectation of what you're expected to be able to do. So your adaptive ability is kind of expected to be greater because you can do more things. So it might be a reflection of that. Or it could be that the older individuals in our sample were diagnosed at a time when genetic screening wasn't as readily available, and you might have had to have a more severe presentation to be referred for genetic screening. Whereas now it's much more ready. Well, that in the UK that's true anyway, but I think it is elsewhere as well. Whereas now you might not necessarily have to have as severe developmental difficulties to be referred for genetic testing. So that might explain why we're seeing this relationship. We also secondly found a relationship between emotional behavioural problems and total repetitive behaviours. And this could mean that children that show more difficulties with emotional and behavioural problems also show more repetitive behaviours. And it could be that both of these measures are capturing some form of emotional dysregulation. And this is something that can be explored in kind of further research. For example, we don't know why someone engages in repetitive behaviors. It could be because that's their way of expressing their emotional difficulties, or it could be for different reasons. So you might do something repetitively because you want to gain sensory input, but maybe in the future, by understanding why someone engages in repetitive behaviors, we might then be able to unpick this relationship between higher emotional behavioral problems and higher repetitive problems, but something I'm not able to answer yet. And finally, we found a relationship between parent-reported epilepsy and adaptive ability. So, whereby children, young people with epilepsy have poorer adaptive ability. And there are several possible reasons why this might be. So, having seizures or having epilepsy might influence your cognitive development. And that is some evidence from children that have a different genetic condition called tuberous sclerosis that the seizure severity might impact their cognitive. Infants with more severe seizures might have poorer cognitive outcomes at 2. So there is potentially a relationship between seizures and cognitive development, but it also could be the case that both epilepsy and adaptive ability reflect disruptions to brain development. So if your brain development is not kind of going along the typical path, it might be that you're more likely to have epilepsy and you're more likely to have difficulties with your adaptive ability. And finally, having seizure medication, there's always a kind of constant trade-off between managing those seizures effectively and then also whether that seizure medication might have kind of unintended negative consequences on developmental delay. And we don't know whether that is something that happens, but the way that treatment might interact with someone's developmental abilities is something that kind of needs to be further unpicked as well. So just to summarize, neurodevelopmental and emotional behavioral characteristics are highly variable in CASK-related disorder, and there might be relationships between characteristics and CASK-related disorder, specifically between adaptive ability, age, and epilepsy, and then also between emotional behavioral problems and repetitive behavior. So the keen eye amongst you might have noticed that I didn't actually address research question 3. So in the future, we're hoping to examine whether the presence of epilepsy or brain abnormalities might predict neurodevelopmental variability in CASK-related disorder. We also hope to summarise the medical data for our cohort of children and young people with CASK-related disorder and compare the prevalence rates to those which we have summarised in the literature review that we've conducted. And finally, we hope to write up our findings as a manuscript to be published in scientific journals, but then also as a summary available to non-experts or to clinicians. So I just want to say thank you to everyone who's taken part, to members of the Bingo research team, to Laura, who we wouldn't have been able to do this research without, and to Unique and the CASK Coalition for helping with recruitment. And I'd love to take any questions and have any feedback or ideas on our research. So thank you. I'll stop sharing.
Thank you so much, Jess, and thank you, Kate, and thank you, Alki. It was just incredible. I can't believe you found so much out. And I also feel it does reflect the population that I know. So I do feel, um, that other parents will be able to associate with it. And, it didn't give the whole doom and gloom kind of story either, which, none of us really want. So it was, yeah, it was brilliant. And also just the original, looking at all the already published information, that has never been done before. So that was just incredible. And just hearing that and seeing those figures and those numbers on the different symptoms is just so important because, like I said previously, the information is out there, but it's how accessible and bringing it all together and somebody being able to do that is amazing. So thank you so much. Thank you, Alki, for doing that. That means a lot. Um, yeah, so if you have questions, I think the easiest way is to pop them in the chat, or you can also try putting your hand up. Whether I can find you or not, to then allow you to speak is another matter. Chat might be easiest. I will try my best. But yeah, Jess, thank you so much, and thank you for persevering with us as a very, I guess, heterogeneous disorder that gives you lots of different answers rather than one simple one. And I feel like the parents that have children with maybe more emotional and behavioral issues, like they know not everybody has them, but I feel like they will feel like they're not alone, that they're not the only ones. And the same with the parents who don't have children with behavioral or specific emotional needs, need maybe not panic that they will get these. There is just this difference within the community, which is really important to know, and nobody should be worrying that this is going to happen, or this one size fits all. So let me open the chat. Oh, it probably okay. I'm not. Okay, so Emily says, thank you, Jess. Fantastic to hear some of the headlines from the study. Oh, so Emily took part. Isla and I love meeting you both and taking part.
Oh,
And
thank you, Emily. That's great that you enjoyed taking part in the study. It was really fun to come and meet you and Isla as well.
yeah, and the same. So, and also, myself and my daughter took part. Yeah, and it was just amazing. So, Kim says, is there research available for study about interventions and/or behavioural treatments for these impacts to patients with CASK?
Yeah. So this is something that we kind of think about when we're thinking about measuring emotional behavioural difficulties. So obviously people want to know how they can best support their children. So I think one of the kind of best advice we can give is that there's no evidence that there needs to be kind of behavioural interventions or treatments that are specific to individuals with CAS. So, for example, most of my research is focused on anxiety, and we know that there are kind of really good interventions for individuals that do have anxiety that are not specific to people with CAS. So you can speak to kind of your pediatrician about kind of management of anxiety in children, and we know that there are some really great interventions out there. So from kind of more behavioral based therapies, and then also medication is sometimes an option as well. So I wouldn't say that there's necessarily that these treatments need to be specific to CAST, because children with a range of different genetic conditions, but then also without genetic conditions, might experience emotional behavioral challenges. So I think the best way to kind of think about treatment interventions is to think about what's already out there for many of these emotional behavioral difficulties. But that being said, there are some people that are researching interventions that might need to be modified. For example, if your child doesn't have language, then we need to think about other ways of kind of intervening or giving them support that is kind of encompassing of their like additional needs. So I hope that answers your question.
Maria says, is it just for UK patients? And thank
Um,
you.
so thank you for the question. Unfortunately, we've stopped our recruitment now, but if you were to want to take part in bingo in the future, we don't just recruit individuals from the UK. So the data that I presented is from individuals all over the world. So I think we had some families in the US and Australia take part as well, off the top of my head.
Are there a few ways to best identify anxiety in individuals that do not speak or have common communication? Yeah, I guess with our children, it's very difficult to know, is it anxiety? You might not be able to answer this. But yeah, that's a very good question, Kim.
Yeah, so I think we currently don't have like a there's not like a set list of things that you should look out for to identify anxiety, but people that don't have language can still experience anxiety or worries or fears, and I think it's just about kind of you as parents know your child best and thinking about whether you identify kind of patterns of behavior. So is there something in particular that is making them show kind of a stress response, or they're really disliking, to kind of notice that, and then talk to your pediatrician about whether they think that is anxiety, because yeah, it is really difficult to know, but there are some kind of behavioral markers of anxiety that people show that can be things like I guess kind of if there's something they really don't like, they might constantly avoid that item. So if I don't know, say you have a fear of dogs, you might show kind of really stressed face, like teeth grinding. You might see kind of flushness. Your child might want to kind of look away, or if they can if they have ambulatory behaviors, they might want to crawl away, run away. So yeah, there are things you can look out for, but I wouldn't over interpret or overanalyze them, but kind of be aware and talk to your pediatrician if you have any worries.
Thank you. Emma says, thank you for presenting your wonderful research. Your slides are really beautiful. Any thoughts on the number of cases that have been identified in the literature and how potentially milder cases are not yet identified as CASK-related disorders? Because you did mention that there is a spectrum.
Mhm.
When our daughter was diagnosed 3 years ago, the N was also approximately 150. And I often wonder, is there a higher prevalence that could impact some of the measurement outcomes?
Yeah, so that's a really great question. And um, as Laura was mentioning, that like at the beginning, that we have a kind of registry of individuals in the UK, so we maybe know how many people there are, and other countries might have similar things. But it is really hard to get an estimate of exactly how many individuals there are. And published literature tends to make individuals' information anonymized. We can't know exactly who it is, but we've been able to kind of identify who has been reported on and if they've been reported on in the past, and that's why that number is around 150 um, of cases in the literature. But that doesn't mean that that's cases in the whole world, because there are people that are not included in those studies who exist as well. So that's why it might look like the numbers not changed, but that's just published literature, not actual cases. Um, and it could be true as well that there are people with milder presentations that maybe are not identified either because they've not gone through genetic testing yet, and they might exist. People might be out there with a CASK gene difference that don't have a diagnosis because they have quite a mild presentation. So that might mean that our data is skewed towards people that have more severe difficulties. That is possible. But I think one thing that we've kind of noticed is that actually now there's kind of been a rapid increase in the number of people that have genetic testing available to them. So when kind of Kirsten did her first work, she identified CASK in people that had kind of very severe brain structural differences, so MIC, PCH. And now we're actually seeing kind of a broader range of individuals being identified through genetic testing that maybe don't have a brain abnormality and might have a less severe phenotype. So important to kind of keep doing this research, keep including families that maybe both have children that do have severe presentations but don't, so we can really understand kind of range of abilities and dimensions of abilities, because no one child with CASK is going to be exactly the same. So you really need kind of families both with children that are severely affected and those that aren't to take part in research. So I hope that addresses the core question.
Thank you. That was a very good answer. And I agree. Yeah, everybody needs to take part in research if they possibly can, all ages and abilities, because yeah, and especially the milder ones in a way, because like you said, the ones with the more obvious symptoms are going to be the ones that tend to be picked up and potentially studied. So yeah, it's really important. Um, so Emily's been looking into a cask and GABA interaction. Um, have you heard of kind of GABA being implicated in emotional dysregulation if there is a GABA imbalance?
Mhm. Yeah, so I might not be the best person to answer this as my neuroscience and neurophysiology and biology is not the best. But GABA is one of the main neurotransmitters in the brain, and it has been linked in to a wide range of emotional behavioral difficulties. So I don't think that's necessarily caste specific. But yeah, there are links between kind of I don't know if CASK is a gene that directly affects GABA and how it's produced in the brain. I don't think it does. But yeah, there have been many studies showing kind of a link between GABA and emotional behavioral difficulties. So it's not CASK specific. It's just one of the chemicals in our brain that influences how our brain cells might communicate, and that might then have a wider impact on emotional behavior. But if Kate wants to jump in and add anything, please do. um, so yeah, no,
Jess is
there's
doing a fantastic job. I was just typing something, just doing a fantastic job. I think it's just sort of outlines there. We really need to keep bringing together a really broad community of researchers to work together with families to build the bridge between the gene variants, how they impact on cells and brain development, right the way through to learning, emotion and behavioural difficulties. Because I was thinking these things are a bit like an onion. You need to understand every layer of the onion to put it all together and understand the links between levels, which is what we think makes this research really interesting, a bit challenging, but really important as well. So, you know, I think it's fantastic to hear that you're working with animal neuroscientists, and we also, if we can, love to do human-based neuroscience. We've not got a plan to do that at the moment with CASK, but using any methods that are appropriate to people with CASK variants to actually understand a bit about what's going on underneath the surface. So we can sort of start to build up understanding at all those different levels. I just wanted to make one comment. It's not necessary because Jess has done a fantastic job. I always find it really interesting and important to notice what doesn't correlate within any group. Obviously, this is a relatively small group, and you've got to be a bit cautious of correlations, but I think it's really important to say that the severity of someone's developmental delay doesn't necessarily predict their emotional, behavioural, and social strengths or difficulties. Those two things can be separate. So you can have somebody who's really got quite good communication skills and motor skills, but might really struggle with managing relationships, new experiences, and anxiety. And on the other hand, you can have people who, for whom the day-to-day activities seem really limited, but they don't necessarily have those difficulties. Is that right, Jess? And we've definitely, this isn't unique to CASK. We've seen that in other conditions too. But I think it's an important message for families to get message that just because your child might have milder communication difficulties doesn't mean they don't need help with other aspects of their neurodevelopment. And if there's one useful thing I hope our research does, it's just to give backup to families, as you said, Laura, back up to your experiences as families, to say, you know, the areas that your child is doing well with, that's great. But if they are having difficulties with managing repetitive behaviours or worries, and that's interfering with day-to-day life, that's part of the picture of CASK, and that's something to ask about and get help with, if that makes sense. They
Yeah,
don't always just go together. So this word sort of severe as a lumping everything together doesn't always fit the real life picture. And we'd like to know why that is at a sort of neuroscience and psychology level. But in terms of help, I think that can just be an important message. There's not one thing called mild or severe. It's a bit more complex than that.
Okay, we better have
We
this
need
as
to
the
move
last
on.
question,
Thank
I
you so
think.
much for your questions, though, because as we're just at the stage now where Alki's put together this fantastic, really comprehensive review table, and Jess has analysed all the data, and our aim is to bring those together into one research paper that we're working on finalising this summer. We'll certainly send it. Well, Laura's going to be an author on it, so we'll certainly send her feedback. Absolutely, you're being critical to the research, and you'll give us your feedback on that. I mean, after your holidays, we've got time. But this is so helpful for us to know. And if you do have suggestions or ideas about which elements you think are most relevant or a bit complicated, that won't change the data, but will really help us to kind of get the balanced messages right when we write up this paper this summer, and hope to be able to share it as at least a freely available preprint by the autumn.